The Red Room by H.G. Wells. I can assure you, said I, that it will take a very tangible ghost to frighten me. And I stood up before the fire with my glass in my hand. It is your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm, and glanced at me askance. 28 years, said I have lived, and never a ghost have I seen as yet. The old woman sat staring hard into the fire, her pale eyes wide open. Aye, she broke in, and 28 years you have lived and never seen the likes of this house, I reckon. There's a many things to see when one's still but 28. She swayed her head slowly from side to side. A many things to see and sorrow for. I half suspected the old people were trying to enhance the spiritual terrors of their house by their droning insistence. I put down my empty glass on the table and looked about the room, and caught a glimpse of myself, abbreviated and broadened to an almost impossible sturdiness, in the queer old mirror at the end of the room. Well, I said, if I see anything tonight, I shall be so much the wiser, for I come to the business with an open mind. It's your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm once more. I heard the sound of a stick and a shambling step on the flags in the passage outside, and the door creaked on its hinges as a second old man entered, more bent, more wrinkled, more aged even than the first. He supported himself by a single crutch. His eyes were covered by a shade, and his lower lip, half averted, hung pale and pink from his decaying yellow teeth. He made straight for an armchair on the opposite side of the table, sat down clumsily, and began to cough. The man with the withered arm gave this newcomer a short glance of positive dislike. The old woman took no notice of his arrival, but remained with her eyes fixed steadily on the fire. I said, it's your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm when the coughing had ceased for a while. It's my own choosing, I answered. The man with the shade became aware of my presence for the first time and threw his head back for a moment and sideways to see me. I caught a momentary glimpse of his eyes, small and bright and inflamed. Then he began to cough and splutter again. Why don't you drink, said the man with the withered arm, pushing the beer towards him. The man with the shade poured out a glassful with a shaky arm that splashed half as much again on the deal table. A monstrous shadow of him crouched upon the wall and mocked his actions as he poured and drank. I must confess, I had scarce expected these grotesque custodians. There is, to my mind, something inhuman in senility, something crouching and atavistic. The human qualities seem to drop from old people insensibly day by day. The three of them made me feel uncomfortable, with their gaunt silences, their bent carriage, their evident unfriendliness to me and to one another. If, said I, you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will make myself comfortable there. The old man with the cough jerked his head back so suddenly that it startled me, and shot another glance of his red eyes at me from under the shade, but no one answered me. I waited for a minute, glancing from one to the other. If, I said a little louder, if you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will relieve you from the task of entertaining me. There's a candle on the slab outside the door, said the man with the withered arm, looking at my feet as he addressed me. But if you go to the Red Room tonight, this night of all nights, said the old woman, you go alone. Very well, I answered. And which way do I go? You go along the passage for a bit, said he, until you come to a door, and through that is a spiral staircase. And halfway up that is a landing and another door covered with baize. Go through that and down the long corridor to the end, and the Red Room is on your left up the steps. "Have I got that right?" I said, and repeated his directions. He corrected me in one particular. "And are you really going?" said the man with the shade, looking at me again for the third time with that queer, unnatural tilting of the face. "This night of all nights," said the old woman. "It is what I came for," I said, and moved toward the door. As I did so, the old man with the shade rose and staggered round the room so as to be closer to the others and to the fire. At the door, I turned and looked at them, and saw they were all close together, dark against the firelight, staring at me over their shoulders with an intent expression on their ancient faces. "Good night," I said, setting the door open. "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm. I left the door wide open until the candle was well alight, and then I shut them in and walked down the chilly, echoing passage. I must confess that the oddness of these 3 old pensioners, in whose charge her ladyship had left the castle, and the deep-toned, old-fashioned furniture of the housekeeper's room in which they had foregathered, affected me in spite of my efforts to keep myself at a matter-of-fact phase. They seemed to belong to another age, an older age, an age when things spiritual were different from this of ours, less certain, an age when omens and witches were credible, and ghosts beyond denying. Their very existence was spectral, the cut of their clothing, fashions born in dead brains. The ornaments and conveniences of the room about them were ghostly, the thoughts of vanished men which still haunted rather than participated in the world of today. But with an effort, I sent such thoughts to the right about. The long, drafty subterranean passage was chilly and dusty, and my candle flared and made the shadows cower and quiver. The echoes rang up and down the spiral staircase, and a shadow came sweeping up after me, and one fled before me into the darkness overhead. I came to the landing and stopped there for a moment, listening to a rustling that I fancied I heard. Then, satisfied of the absolute silence, I pushed open the baize-covered door and stood in the corridor. The effect was scarcely what I expected, for the moonlight, coming in by the great window on the grand staircase, picked out everything in vivid black shadow or silvery illumination. Everything was in its place. The house might have been deserted on the yesterday instead of 18 months ago. There were candles in the sockets of the sconces, and whatever dust had gathered on the carpets or upon the polished flooring was distributed so evenly as to be invisible in the moonlight. I was about to advance and stopped abruptly. A bronze group stood upon the landing, hidden from me by the corner of the wall, but its shadow fell with marvelous distinctness upon the white paneling and gave me the impression of someone crouching to waylay me. I stood rigid for half a minute, perhaps. Then, with my hand in the pocket that held my revolver, I advanced, only to discover a Ganymede and eagle glistening in the moonlight. That incident for a time restored my nerve, and a porcelain man on a buhl table, whose head rocked silently as I passed him, scarcely startled me. The door to the Red Room and the steps up to it were in a shadowy corner. I moved my candle from side to side in order to see clearly the nature of the recess in which I stood before opening the door. Here it was, thought I, that my predecessor was found, and the memory of that story gave me a sudden twinge of apprehension. I glanced over my shoulder at the Ganymede in the moonlight, and opened the door of the Red Room rather hastily, with my face half turned to the pallid silence of the landing. I entered, closed the door behind me at once, turned the key I found in the lock within, and stood with the candle held aloft, surveying the scene of my vigil, the great Red Room of Lorraine Castle, in which the young Duke had died, or rather, in which he had begun his dying, for he had opened the door and fallen headlong down the steps I had just ascended. That had been the end of his vigil, of the gallant attempt to conquer the ghostly tradition of the place, and never, I thought, had apoplexy better served the ends of superstition. And there were other and older stories that clung to the room, back to the half-credible beginning of it all, the tale of a timid wife and the tragic end that came to her husband's jest of frightening her. And looking around that large, shadowy room, with its shadowy window bays, its recesses and alcoves, one could well understand the legends that had sprouted in its black corners, its germinating darkness. My candle was a little tongue of light in its vastness that failed to pierce the opposite side of the room, and left an ocean of mystery and suggestion beyond its island of light. I resolved to make a systematic examination of the place at once and dispel the fanciful suggestions of its obscurity before they obtained a hold on me. After satisfying myself of the fastening of the door, I began to walk about the room, peering round each article of furniture, tucking up the valances of the bed, and opening its curtains wide. I pulled up the blinds and examined the fastenings of the several windows before closing the shutters, leant forward and looked up the blackness of the wide chimney, and tapped the dark oak paneling for any secret opening. There were 2 big mirrors in the room, each with a pair of sconces bearing candles, and on the mantel shelf, too, were more candles and china candlesticks. All these I lit, one after the other. The fire was laid, an unexpected consideration from the old housekeeper, and I lit it to keep down any disposition to shiver. And when it was burning well, I stood round with my back to it and regarded the room again. I had pulled up a chintz-covered armchair and a table to form a kind of barricade before me, and on this lay my revolver, ready to hand. My precise examination had done me good, but I still found the remoter darkness of the place, and its perfect stillness, too stimulating for the imagination. The echoing of the stir and crackling of the fire was no sort of comfort to me. The shadow in the alcove, and the end in particular, had that undefinable quality of a presence, that odd suggestion of a lurking living thing that comes so easily in silence and solitude. At last, to reassure myself, I walked with a candle into it and satisfied myself that there was nothing tangible there. I stood that candle upon the floor of the alcove and left it in that position. By this time I was in a state of considerable nervous tension, although to my reason there was no adequate cause for this condition. My mind, however, was perfectly clear. I postulated quite unreservedly that nothing supernatural could happen, and to pass the time I began to string some rhymes together, in Goldsby fashion, of the original legend of the place. A few I spoke aloud, but the echoes were not pleasant. For the same reason, I also abandoned, after a time, a conversation with myself upon the impossibility of ghosts and haunting. My mind reverted to the 3 old and distorted people downstairs, and I tried to keep it upon that topic. The somber reds and blacks of the room troubled me. Even with 7 candles, the place was merely dim. The one in the alcove flared in a draught, and the fire flickering kept the shadows and penumbra perpetually shifting and stirring. Casting about for a remedy, I recalled the candles I had seen in the passage and, with a slight effort, walked out into the moonlight, carrying a candle and leaving the door open, and presently returned with as many as 10. These I put in various knickknacks of china with which the room was sparsely adorned, lit and placed where the shadows had lain deepest, some on the floor, some in the window recesses, until at last my 17 candles were so arranged that not an inch of the room but had the direct light of at least one of them. It occurred to me that when the ghost came, I could warn him not to trip over them. The room was now quite brightly illuminated. There was something very cheery and reassuring in these little streaming flames, and snuffing them gave me an occupation and afforded a reassuring sense of the passage of time. Even with that, however, the brooding expectation of the vigil weighed heavily upon me. It was after midnight that the candle in the alcove suddenly went out, and the black shadow sprang back to its place there. I did not see the candle go out. I simply turned and saw that the darkness was there, as one might start and see the unexpected presence of a stranger. "By Jove," said I aloud, "that draft's a strong one." And taking the matches from the table, I walked across the room in a leisurely manner to relight the corner again. My first match would not strike, and as I succeeded with the second, something seemed to blink on the wall before me. I turned my head involuntarily and saw that the 2 candles on the little table by the fireplace were extinguished. I rose at once to my feet. "Odd," I said. "Did I do that myself in a flash of absent-mindedness?" I walked back, relit one, and as I did so, I saw the candle in the right sconce of one of the mirrors wink and go right out, and almost immediately its companion followed it. There was no mistake about it. The flame vanished, as if the wicks had been suddenly nipped between a finger and a thumb, leaving the wick neither glowing nor smoking, but black. While I stood gaping, the candle at the foot of the bed went out, and the shadows seemed to take another step toward me. "This won't do," said I, and first one and then another candle on the mantel shelf followed. "What's up?" I cried, with a queer high note getting into my voice somehow. At that, the candle on the wardrobe went out, and the one I had relit in the alcove followed. "Steady on," I said. "These candles are wanted," speaking with a half-hysterical facetiousness, and scratching away at a match the while for the mantel candlesticks. My hands trembled so much that twice I missed the rough paper of the matchbox. As the mantel emerged from the darkness again, 2 candles in the remoter end of the window were eclipsed. But with the same match, I also relit the larger mirror candles and those on the floor near the doorway, so that for the moment I seemed to gain on the extinctions. But then, in a volley, there vanished 4 lights at once in different corners of the room, and I struck another match in quivering haste and stood hesitating whether to take it. As I stood undecided, an invisible hand seemed to sweep out the 2 candles on the table. With a cry of terror, I dashed at the alcove, then into the corner, and then into the window, relighting 3 as 2 more vanished by the fireplace. Then, perceiving a better way, I dropped the matches on the iron-bound deed box in the corner and caught up all the bedroom candlestick. With this, I avoided the delay of striking matches, but for all that, the steady process of extinction went on, and the shadows I feared and fought again returned and crept in upon me, first a step gained upon the side of me, and then on that. It was like a ragged storm cloud sweeping out the stars. Now and then one returned for a minute and was lost again. I was now almost frantic with the horror of the coming darkness, and my self-possession deserted me. I leaped, panting and disheveled, from candle to candle in a vain struggle against that remorseless advance. I bruised myself on the thigh against the table. I sent a chair headlong. I stumbled and fell and whisked the cloth from the table in my fall. My candle rolled away from me, and I snatched another as I rose. Abruptly, this was blown out as I swung it off the table by the wind of my sudden movement, and immediately the 2 remaining candles followed. But there was light still in the room, a red light that staved off the shadows from me. The fire, of course. I could still thrust my candle between the bars and relight it. I turned to where the flames were still dancing between the glowing coals and splashing red reflections upon the furniture, made 2 steps toward the grate, and incontinently the flames dwindled and vanished, The glow vanished, the reflections rushed together and vanished, and as I thrust the candle between the bars, darkness closed upon me like the shutting of an eye, wrapped around me in a stifling embrace, sealed my vision, and crushed the last vestiges of reason from my brain. The candle fell from my hand. I flung out my arms in a vain effort to thrust that ponderous blackness away from me, and, lifting up my voice, screamed with all my might, once, twice, thrice. Then, I think, I must have staggered to my feet. I know I thought suddenly of the moonlit corridor, and, with my head bowed and my arms over my face, made a run for the door. But I had forgotten the exact position of the door, and struck myself heavily against the corner of the bed. I staggered back, turned, and was either stuck or struck myself against some other bulky furniture. I have a vague memory of battering myself thus, to and fro in the darkness, of a cramped struggle, and of my own wild crying as I darted to and fro, of a heavy blow at last upon my forehead, a horrible sensation of falling that lasted an age, of my last frantic effort to keep my footing, and then I remember no more. I opened my eyes in daylight. My head was roughly bandaged, and the man with the withered arm was watching my face. I looked about me, trying to remember what had happened, and for a space I could not recollect. I rolled my eyes into the corner and saw the old woman, no longer abstracted, pouring out some drops of medicine from a little blue phial into a glass. "Where am I?" I asked. "I seem to remember you, and yet I cannot remember who you are." They told me then, and I heard of the haunted red room as one who hears a tale. "We found you at dawn," said he, "and there was blood on your forehead and lips." It was very slowly I recovered my memory of my experience. "You believe now," said the old man, "that the room is haunted." He spoke no longer as one who greets an intruder, but as one who grieves for a broken friend. "Yes," said I, "the room is haunted, and you have seen it, and we, who have lived here all our lives, have never set eyes upon it, because we have never dared. Tell us, is it truly the old Earl who—" "No," said I, "it is not." "I told you so," said the old lady with the glass in her hand. "It was his poor young countess who was frightened." "It is not," I said. "There is neither ghost of Earl nor ghost of countess in that room. There is no ghost there at all, but worse, far worse." "Well," they said, "the worst of all the things that haunt poor mortal man," said I, "and that is, in all its nakedness, fear. Fear that will not have lights nor sound, that will not bear with reason, that deafens and darkens and overwhelms. It followed me through the corridor. It fought against me in the room." I stopped abruptly. There was an interval of silence. My hand went up to my bandages. Then the man with the shade sighed and spoke. "That is it," said he. "I knew that was it. A power of darkness. To put such a curse upon a woman. It lurks there always. You can feel it even in the daytime, even of a bright summer's day, in the hangings, in the curtains, keeping behind you however you face them. In the dusk it creeps along the corridor and follows you so that you dare not turn. There is fear in that room of hers. Black fear, and there will be, so long as this house of sin endures." The Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells. The scene amidst which Clayton told his last story comes back very vividly to my mind. There he sat, for the greater part of the time, in the corner of the authentic settle by the spacious open fire, and Sanderson sat beside him smoking the Brosley clay that bore his name. There was Evans, and that marvel among actors, Wish, who is also a modest man. We had all come down to the Mermaid Club that Saturday morning, except Clayton, who had slept there overnight, which, indeed, gave him the opening of his story. We had golfed until golfing was invisible. We had dined, and we were in that mood of tranquil kindliness when men will suffer a story. When Clayton began to tell one, we naturally supposed he was lying. It may be that, indeed, he was lying. Of that the reader will speedily be able to judge as well as I. He began, it is true, with an air of matter-of-fact anecdote, but that, we thought, was only the incurable artifice of the man.
"I say,"
he remarked, after a long consideration of the upward rain of sparks from the log that Sanderson had thumped.
"You know I was alone here last night?"
"Except for the domestics," said Wish.
"Who sleep in the other wing,"
said Clayton.
"Yes, well..."
He pulled at his cigar for some little time, as though he still hesitated about his confidence. Then he said, quite quietly,
"I caught a ghost."
"Caught a ghost, did you?" said Sanderson. "Where is it?" And Evans, who admires Clayton immensely and has been 4 weeks in America, shouted, "Caught a ghost, did you, Clayton? I'm glad of it. Tell us all about it right now." Clayton said he would in a minute, and asked him to shut the door. He looked apologetically at me.
"There's no eavesdropping, of course, but we don't want to upset our very excellent service with any rumors of ghosts in the place. There's too much shadow and oak paneling to trifle with that. And this, you know, wasn't a regular ghost. I don't think it will ever come again. Ever."
"You mean to say that you didn't keep it?" said Sanderson.
"I hadn't the heart to,"
said Clayton. And Sanderson said he was surprised. We laughed, and Clayton looked aggrieved.
"I know," he said with the flicker of a smile, "but the fact is it really was a ghost, and I'm as sure of it as I am that I am talking to you now. I'm not joking. I mean what I say."
Sanderson drew deeply at his pipe, with one reddish eye on Clayton, and then emitted a thin jet of smoke more eloquent than many words. Clayton ignored the comment.
"It is the strangest thing that has ever happened in my life. You know, I never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort before, ever. And then, you know, I bag one in a corner, and the whole business is in my hands."
He meditated still more profoundly, and produced and began to pierce a second cigar with a curious little stabber he affected. "You talked to it?" asked Wish.
"For the space of probably an hour."
"Chatty?" I said, joining the party of the skeptics.
"The poor devil was in trouble,"
said Clayton, bowed over his cigar end and with the very faintest note of reproof. "Sobbing?" someone asked. Clayton heaved a realistic sigh at the memory.
"Good Lord," he said. "Yes." And then, "Poor fellow. Yes."
"Where did you strike it?" asked Evans in his best American accent.
"I never realized," said Clayton, ignoring him, "the poor sort of a thing a ghost might be."
And he hung up again for a time while he sought for matches in his pocket and lit and warmed to his cigar.
"I took an advantage," he reflected at last.
We were none of us in a hurry.
"A character," he said, "remains just the same character for all that it's been disembodied. That's a thing we too often forget. People with a certain strength or fixity of purpose may have ghosts of a certain strength or fixity of purpose. Most haunting ghosts, you know, must be as one-ideaed as monomaniacs and as obstinate as mules to come back again and again. This poor creature wasn't."
He suddenly looked up, rather queerly, and his eye went round the room.
"I say it," he said, "in all kindliness, but that is the plain truth of the case. Even at the first glance, he struck me as weak."
He punctuated with the help of his cigar.
"I came upon him, you know, in the long passage. His back was towards me, and I saw him first. Right off I knew him for a ghost. He was transparent and whitish. Clean through his chest, I could see the glimmer of the little window at the end. And not only his physique, but his attitude struck me as being weak. He looked, you know, as though he didn't know in the slightest whatever he meant to do. One hand was on the paneling, and the other fluttered toward his mouth, like so.
What sort of physique? Said Sanderson.
Lean. You know that sort of young man's neck that has two great flutings down the back, here and here, so. And a little meanish head with scrubby hair, and rather bad ears. Shoulders bad, narrower than the hips, turn-down collar, ready-made short jacket, trousers baggy, and a little frayed at the heels. That's how he took me. I came very quietly up the staircase. I did not carry a light, you know. The candles are on the landing table, and there is that lamp. And I was in my list slippers, and I saw him as I came up. I stopped dead at that, taking him in. I wasn't a bit afraid. I think that in most of these affairs, one is never nearly so afraid or excited as one imagines one would be. I was surprised and interested. I thought, good Lord, here's a ghost at last. And I haven't believed for a moment in ghosts during the last 25 years.
Said Wish.
I suppose I wasn't on the landing a moment before he found out I was there. He turned on me sharply, and I saw the face of an immature young man. A weak nose, a scrubby little mustache, a feeble chin. So for an instant we stood, he looking over his shoulder at me and regarding one another. Then he seemed to remember his high calling. He turned round, drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, spread his hands in approved ghost fashion, came toward me. As he did so, his little jaw dropped, and he emitted a faint, drawn-out "Boo." No, it wasn't. Not a bit dreadful. I'd dined, I'd had a bottle of champagne, and being all alone, perhaps 2 or 3, perhaps even 4 or 5 whiskies. So I was as solid as rocks, and no more frightened than if I'd been assailed by a frog. "Boo," I said. "Nonsense. You don't belong to this place. What are you doing here?" I could see him wince. "Boo." "Boo, be hanged. Are you a member?" I said. And just to show I didn't care a pin for him, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. "Are you a member?" I repeated, looking at him sideways. He moved a little, so as to stand clear of me, and his bearing became crestfallen. "No," he said, in answer to the persistent interrogation of my eye. "I'm not a member. I'm a ghost." "Well, that doesn't give you the run of the Mermaid Club. Is there anyone you want to see, or anything of that sort?" And doing it as steadily as possible for fear that he should mistake the carelessness of whiskey for the distraction of fear, I got my candle alight. I turned it on him, holding it. "What are you doing here?" I said. He had dropped his hands and stopped his booing, and there he stood, abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, silly, aimless young man. "I'm haunting," he said. "You haven't any business to," I said in a quiet voice. "I'm a ghost," he said, as if in defense. "That may be, but you haven't any business to haunt here. This is a respectable private club. People often stop here with nursemaids and children, and going about in the careless way you do, some poor little mite could easily come upon you and be scared out of her wits. I suppose you didn't think of that?" "No, sir," he said. "I didn't." "You should have done. You haven't any claim on the place, have you? Weren't murdered here or anything of that sort?"
None, sir, but I thought, as it was old and oak-paneled.
That's no excuse, I regarded him firmly. Your coming here is a mistake, I said, in a tone of friendly superiority. I feigned to see if I had my matches, and then looked up at him frankly. If I were you, I wouldn't wait for cock crow. I'd vanish right away. He looked embarrassed.
The fact is, sir,
he began. I'd vanish, I said, driving it home.
The fact is, sir, that somehow I can't.
You can't.
No, sir. There's something I've forgotten. I've been hanging around here since midnight last night, hiding in the cupboards of the empty bedrooms and things like that. I'm flurried. I've never come haunting before, and it seems to put me out.
Put you out?
Yes, sir. I've tried to do it several times, and it doesn't come off. There's some little thing has slipped me, and I can't get back.
That, you know, rather bowled me over. He looked at me in such an abject way that for the life of me I couldn't keep quite the high, hectoring vein I had adopted. That's queer, I said. And as I spoke, I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. Come into my room and tell me more about it, I said. I didn't, of course, understand this, and I tried to take him by the arm. But, of course, you might as well have tried to take hold of a puff of smoke. I had forgotten my number, I think. Anyhow, I remember going into several bedrooms. It was lucky I was the only soul in that wing, until I saw my traps. Here we are, I said, and sat down in the armchair. Sit down and tell me all about it. It seems to me you have got yourself into a jolly awkward position, old chap. Well, he said he wouldn't sit down. He'd prefer to flit up and down the room if it was all the same to me. And so he did. And in a little while we were deep in a long and serious talk. And presently, you know, something of these whiskies and sodas evaporated out of me, and I began to realize just a little what a thundering rum and weird business it was that I was in. There he was, semi-transparent, the proper conventional phantom, and noiseless except for the ghost of a voice, flitting to and fro in that nice, clean, chintz-hung old bedroom. You could see the gleam of the copper candlesticks through him, and the lights on the brass fender, and the corners of the framed engravings on the wall. And there he was, telling me all about this wretched little life of his that had recently ended on Earth. He hadn't a particularly honest face, you know, but being transparent, of course, he couldn't avoid telling the truth.
Eh? Said Wish, suddenly sitting up in his chair.
Eh, what?
Said Clayton. Being transparent, couldn't avoid telling the truth. I don't see it, said Wish.
I don't see it,
said Clayton with inimitable assurance.
But it is so. I can assure you nevertheless. I don't believe he got once a nail's breadth off the Bible truth. He told me how he had been killed. He went down into a London basement with a candle to look for a leakage of gas, and described himself as a senior English master in a London private school when that release occurred.
Poor wretch, said I.
That's what I thought. And the more he talked about it, I thought it. There he was, purposeless in life and purposeless out of it. He talked of his father and mother and his schoolmaster, and all who had ever been anything to him in the world, meanly. He had been too sensitive, too nervous. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He had never had a real friend in the world, I think. He had never had a success, He had shirked games and failed examinations. "And where are you now?" I asked. "Not in..." He wasn't clear on that point at all. The impression he gave me was of a sort of vague, intermediate state. A special reserve for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin or virtue. I don't know. He was much too egotistical and unobservant to give me any clear idea of the kind of place, kind of country there is on the other side of things. Wherever he was, he seems to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of weak Cockney young men who were on a footing of Christian names. And among these there was certainly a lot of talk about going haunting and things like that. Yes, going haunting. They seemed to think haunting a tremendous adventure, and most of them flunked it all the time. And so primed, you know, he had come.
"But really," said Wish to the fire.
"These are the impressions he gave me, anyhow,"
said Clayton modestly.
"I may, of course, have been in a rather uncritical state, but that was the sort of background he gave to himself. He kept flitting up and down, with his thin voice talking about his wretched self, and never a word of clear, firm statement from first to last. He was thinner and sillier and more pointless than if he had been real and alive. Only then, you know, he would not have been in my bedroom here. If he had been alive, I should have kicked him out."
"Of course," said Evans, "there are poor mortals like that. And there's just as much a chance of them having ghosts as the rest of us," I admitted.
"What gave a sort of point to him, you know, was the fact that he did seem within limits to have found himself out. The mess he had made of haunting had depressed him terribly. He had been told it would be a lark. He had come expecting it to be a lark, and here it was, nothing but another failure added to his record. He proclaimed himself an utter out-and-out failure. He said, and I can quite believe it, that he had never tried to do anything all his life that he hadn't made a perfect mess of. And through all the wastes of eternity, he never would. If he had sympathy, perhaps." He paused at that and stood regarding me. He remarked that, strange as it may seem to me, nobody, not anyone, ever had given him the amount of sympathy I was doing now. I could see what he wanted straight away, and I determined to head him off at once. I may be a brute, you know, but being the only real friend, the recipient of the confidences of one of these egotistical weaklings, ghost or body, is beyond my physical endurance. I got up briskly. "Don't you brood on these things too much," I said. "The thing you've got to do is get out of this. Get out of this sharp. You pull yourself together and try." "I can't," he said. "You try," I said. And try he did.
"Try?" said Sanderson. "How?"
"Passes," said Clayton.
"Passes?"
"Complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands. That's how he had come in, and that's how he had to get out again. Lord, what a business I had."
"But how could any series of passes?" I began.
"My dear man,"
said Clayton, turning on me and putting a great emphasis on certain words.
"You want everything clear. I don't know how. All I know is that you do, that he did. Anyhow, at least. After a fearful time, you know, he got his passes right and suddenly disappeared."
"Did you," said Sanderson slowly, "observe the passes?"
"Yes,"
said Clayton, and seemed to think.
"It was tremendously queer. There we were, I and this thin, vague ghost, in that silent room, in this silent, empty inn, in this silent little Friday night town. Not a ghost except our voices. There was the bedroom candle, and one candle on the dressing table. That was all. Sometimes one or other would flare up into a tall, lean, astonished flame for space. And queer things happened.
I can't,
He said,
I shall never.
and suddenly he sat down on a little chair at the foot of the bed and began to sob and sob. Lord, what a harrowing, whimpering thing he seemed. You pull yourself together, I said, and tried to pat him on the back, and my confounded hand went through him. By that time, you know, I wasn't nearly so massive as I had been on the landing. I got the queerness of it full. I remember snatching back my hand out of him, as it were, with a little thrill, and walking over to the dressing table. You pull yourself together, I said to him, and try. And in order to encourage and help him, I began to try as well.
What? Said Sanderson. The passes?
Yes, the passes.
But, I said, moved by an idea that eluded me for a space. This is interesting, said Sanderson, with his finger in his pipe bowl. You mean to say this ghost of yours gave away?
Did his level best to get away the whole confounded barrier? Yes.
He didn't, said Wish. He couldn't. Or you'd have gone there too. That's precisely it, I said, finding my elusive idea put into words for me.
That is precisely it,
said Clayton, with thoughtful eyes upon the fire. For just a little while there was silence. And at last he did it, said Sanderson.
At last he did it. I had to keep him up to it hard, but he did it at last. Rather suddenly. He despaired. We had a scene, and then he got up abruptly and asked me to go through the whole performance slowly so that he might see.
I believe,
He said.
if I could see, I should spot what was wrong at once.
And he did.
I know,
He said. What do you know? Said I.
I know,
He repeated. Then he said peevishly,
I can't do it if you look at me. I really can't. It's been that, partly, all along. I'm such a nervous fellow that you put me out.
Well, we had a bit of an argument. Naturally, I wanted to see, but he was as obstinate as a mule. And suddenly I had come over as tired as a dog. He tired me out. All right, I said. I won't look at you. And turned toward the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. He started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the looking glass to see just what it was had hung. Round went his arms and his hands, so and so and so. And then with a rush came to the last gesture of all. You stand erect and open out your arms. And so, don't you know, he stood. And then he didn't. He didn't. He wasn't. I wheeled round from the looking glass to him. There was nothing. I was alone, with the flaring candles and a staggering mind. What had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality about it, the clock upon the landing discovered the moment was ripe for striking 1. So, ping! And I was as grave and sober as a judge, with all my champagne and whiskey gone into the vast serene. Feeling queer, you know. Confoundedly queer. Queer! Good Lord!
He regarded his cigar ash for a moment.
That's all that happened,
he said. And then you went to bed? Asked Evans.
What else was there to do?
I looked Wish in the eye. We wanted to scoff, and there was something perhaps in Clayton's voice and manner that hampered our desire. And about these passes, said Sanderson.
I believe I could do them now.
Oh, said Sanderson, and produced a penknife and set himself to grub the dottle out of the bowl of his clay. "Why don't you do them now?" said Sanderson, shutting his penknife with a click.
"That's what I'm going to do,"
said Clayton. "They won't work," said Evans. "If they do," I suggested. "You know, I'd rather you didn't," said Wish, stretching out his legs. "Why?" asked Evans. "I'd rather he didn't," said Wish. "But he hasn't got 'em right," said Sanderson, plugging too much tobacco in his pipe. "All the same, I'd rather he didn't," said Wish. "But you don't believe," I said. Wish glanced at Clayton, who was staring into the fire, weighing something on his mind. "I do. More than half, anyway, I do," said Wish. "Clayton," said I, "you're too good a liar for us. Most of it was all right, but that disappearance happened to be convincing. Tell us, it's a tale of cock and bull." He stood up without heeding me, took the middle of the hearthrug, and faced me. For a moment, he regarded his feet thoughtfully, and then for all the rest of the time his eyes were on the opposite wall with an intent expression. He raised his two hands slowly to the level of his eyes, and so began. "Now, Sanderson is a Freemason, a member of the Lodge of the Four Kings, which devotes itself so ably to the study and elucidation of all the mysteries of Masonry past and present. And among the students of this lodge, Sanderson is by no means the least." He followed Clayton's motions with a singular interest in his reddish eye. "That's not bad," he said when it was done. "You really do, you know, put things together, Clayton, in a most amazing fashion. But there's one little detail out."
"I know," said Clayton. "I believe I could tell you which."
"Well?"
"This," said Clayton, and did a queer little twist and writhing and thrust of the hands.
"Yes."
"That, you know, was what he couldn't get right," said Clayton. "But how do you?"
"Most of this business, and particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all," said Sanderson. "But just that phase, I do," he reflected. "These happen to be a series of gestures, connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry. Perhaps you know, or else... How?" he reflected still further. "I do not see how I could do any harm in telling you just the proper twist. After all, if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't."
"I know nothing," said Clayton, "except what that poor devil let out last night."
"Well, anyhow," said Sanderson, and placed his churchwarden very carefully upon the shelf over the fireplace. Then, very rapidly, he gesticulated with his hands.
"So?"
said Clayton, repeating. "So," said Sanderson, and took his pipe in his hand again.
"Ah, now," said Clayton, "I can do the whole thing. Right."
He stood up before the waning fire and smiled at us all. But I think there was just a little hesitation in his smile.
"If I begin,"
he said. "I wouldn't begin," said Wish. "It's all right," said Evans. "Matter is indestructible. You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of shades? Not it. You may try, Clayton, as far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the wrists." "I don't believe that," said Wish, and stood up and put his arm on Clayton's shoulder. "You've made me half believe in that story somehow, and I don't want to see this thing done." "Goodness," said I, "here's Wish, frightened." "I am," said Wish, with real or admirably feigned intensity. "I believe that if he goes through these motions right, he'll go." "He'll not do anything of the sort," I cried. "There's only one way out of this world for men. Besides, and such a ghost. Do you think—" Wish interrupted me by moving. He walked out from among our chairs and stopped beside the toll and stood there. "Clayton," he said, "you're a fool." Clayton, with a humorous light in his eyes, smiled back at him.
"Wish,"
he said,
is right, and all you others are wrong. I shall go. I shall get to the end of these passes, and as the last swish whistles through the air, presto, the hearthrug will be vacant, the room will be blank amazement, and a respectably dressed gentleman of 15 stone will plump into the world of shades. I'm certain. So will you be. I decline to argue further. Let the thing be tried.
"No," said Wish, and made a step and ceased. And Clayton raised his hands once more to repeat the spirit's passing. By that time, you know, we were all in a state of tension, largely because of the behavior of Wish. We sat, all of us with our eyes on Clayton. I, at least, with a sort of tight, stiff feeling about me, as though from the back of my skull to the middle of my thighs, my body had been changed to steel. And there, with a gravity that was imperturbably serene, Clayton bowed and swayed and waved his hands and arms before us. As he drew toward the end, one piled up, one tangled in one's teeth. The last gesture, I have said, was to swing the arms out wide open, with the face held up. And when, at last, he swung out to this closing gesture, I ceased even to breathe. It was ridiculous, of course, but you know that ghost story feeling. It was after dinner, in a queer, old, shadowy house. Would he, after all? There he stood for one stupendous moment, with his arms open and his upturned face, assured and bright, in the glare of the hanging lamp. We hung through that moment as if it were an age, and then came from all of us something that was half a sigh of infinite relief, and half a reassuring no. For visibly, he wasn't going. It was all nonsense. He had told an idle story and carried it almost to conviction, that was all. And then, in that moment, the face of Clayton changed. It changed. It changed as a lit house changes when its lights are suddenly extinguished. His eyes were suddenly eyes that were fixed. His smile was frozen on his lips, and he stood there still. He stood there, very gently swaying. That moment, too, was an age. And then, you know, chairs were scraping, things were falling, and we were all moving. His knees seemed to give. He fell forward, and Evans rose and caught him in his arms. It stunned us all. For a moment, I suppose no one said a coherent thing. We believed it, yet could not believe it. I came out of a muddled stupefaction to find myself kneeling beside him, and his vest and shirt were torn open, and Sanderson's hand lay on his heart. Well, the simple fact before us could very well wait our convenience. There was no hurry for us to comprehend. It lay there for an hour. It lies athwart my memory, black and amazing still to this day. Clayton had, indeed, passed into the world that lies so near to and so far from our own, and he had gone thither by the only road that mortal men may take. But whether he did indeed pass there by that poor ghost incantation, or whether he was stricken suddenly by apoplexy in the middle of an idle tale, as the coroner's jury would have us believe, is no matter for my judging. It is just one of those inexplicable riddles that must remain unsolved until the final solution of all things shall come. All I certainly know is that, in the very moment, in the very instant of concluding those passes, he changed and staggered and fell down before us, dead. The Flowering of the Strange Orchid by H.G. Wells. The buying of orchids always has in it a certain speculative flavor. You have before you the brown shriveled lump of tissue, and for the rest you must trust your judgment, or the auctioneer, or your good luck, as your taste may incline. The plant may be moribund or dead, or it may be just a respectable purchase, fair value for your money, or perhaps for the thing that has happened again and again. There slowly unfolds before the delighted eyes of the happy purchaser, day after day, some new variety, some novel richness, a strange twist of the labellum, or some subtler coloration or unexpected mimicry. Pride, beauty, and profit blossom together on one delicate green spike, and, it may be, even immortality. For the new miracle of nature may stand in need of a new specific name, and what so convenient as that of its discoverer, John Smithia. There have been worse names. It was perhaps the hope of some happy discovery that made Winter Wedderburn such a frequent attendant at these sales. That hope, and also, maybe, the fact that he had nothing else of the slightest interest to do in the world. He was a shy, lonely, rather ineffectual man, provided with just enough income to keep off the spur of necessity, and not enough nervous energy to make him seek any exacting employments. He might have collected stamps or coins, or translated Horace, or bound books, or invented new species of diatoms. But, as it happened, he grew orchids, and had one ambitious little hothouse. "I have a fancy," he said over his coffee, "that something is going to happen to me today." He spoke as he moved and thought, slowly. "Oh, don't say that," said his housekeeper, who was also his remote cousin. For something happening was a euphemism that meant only one thing to her. "You misunderstand me. I mean nothing unpleasant, though what I do mean, I scarcely know. Today," he continued after a pause, "Peters are going to sell a batch of plants from the Andamans and the Indies. I shall go up and see what they have. It may be that I shall buy something good unawares. That may be it." He passed his cup for his second cupful of coffee. "Are these the things collected by that poor young fellow you told me of the other day?" asked his cousin as she filled his cup. "Yes," he said, and became meditative over a piece of toast. "Nothing ever does happen to me," he remarked presently, beginning to think aloud. "I wonder why. Things enough happen to other people. There is Harvey. Only the other week on Monday he picked up 6 pence. On Wednesday his chicks all had the staggers. On Friday his cousin came home from Australia, and on Saturday he broke his ankle. What a whirl of excitement, compared to me." "I think I would rather be without so much excitement," said his housekeeper. "It can't be good for you." "I suppose it's troublesome. Still, you see, nothing ever happens to me. When I was a little boy, I never had accidents. I never fell in love as I grew up. Never married. I wonder how it feels to have something happen to you. Something really remarkable. That orchid collector was only 36, 20 years younger than myself when he died. And he had been married twice and divorced once. He had had malarial fever 4 times, and once he broke his thigh. He killed a Malay once, and once he was wounded by a poisoned dart. And in the end, he was killed by jungle leeches. It must have all been very troublesome, but then it must have been very interesting, you know. Except, perhaps, the leeches. "I am sure it was not good for him," said the lady with conviction. "Perhaps not." And then Wedderburn looked at his watch. 23 minutes past 8. "I am going up by the 11:45 train, so that there is plenty of time. I think I shall wear my alpaca jacket. It is quite warm enough, and my gray felt hat and brown shoes. I suppose—" He glanced out of the window at the serene sky and sunlit garden, and then nervously at his cousin's face. "I think you had better take an umbrella if you're going to London," she said in a voice that admitted of no denial. "There's all between here and the station coming back." When he returned, he was in a state of mild excitement. He had made a purchase. It was rare that he could make up his mind quickly enough to buy, but this time he had done so. "There are vandas," he said, "and a dendrobe and some paleonophis." He surveyed his purchases lovingly as he consumed his soup. They were laid out on the spotless tablecloth before him, and he was telling his cousin all about them as he slowly meandered through his dinner. It was his custom to live all his visits to London over again in the evening for her and his own entertainment. "I knew something would happen today, and I have bought all these. Some of them. I feel sure, do you know, that some of them will be remarkable. I don't know how it is, but I feel just as sure as if someone had told me that some of these will turn out remarkable. That one," he pointed to a shriveled rhizome, "was not identified. It may be a paleonophis, or it may not. It may be a new species or even a new genus, and it was the last that poor Batten ever collected." "I don't like the look of it," said the housekeeper. "It's such an ugly shape." "To me it scarcely seems to have a shape." "I don't like those things that stick out," said his housekeeper. "It shall be put away in a pot tomorrow." "It looks," said the housekeeper, "like a spider shamming dead." Wedderburn smiled and surveyed the root with his head on one side. "It is certainly not a pretty lump of stuff, but you can never judge of these things from their dry appearance. It may turn out to be a very beautiful orchid indeed. How busy I shall be tomorrow! I must see tonight just exactly what to do with these things, and tomorrow I shall set to work." They found poor Batten lying dead, or dying, in a mangrove swamp, I forget which, he began again presently, with one of these very orchids crushed up against his body. He had been unwell for some days with some kind of native fever, and I suppose he fainted. These mangrove swamps are very unwholesome. Every drop of blood, they say, was taken out of him by the jungle leeches. It may be that very plant that cost him his life to obtain. "Well, I think none the better of it for that." "Men must work, though women may weep," said Wedderburn with profound gravity. "Fancy dying away from every comfort in a nasty swamp, and no one round you but horrible natives. They say the Andaman Islanders are most disgusting wretches, and anyhow, they can scarcely make good nurses, not having the necessary training. And just for people in England to have orchids. I don't suppose it was comfortable, but some men seem to enjoy that kind of thing," said Wedderburn. "Anyhow, the natives of his party were sufficiently civilized to take care of all his collection until his colleague, who was an ornithologist, came back from the interior, though they could not tell the species of the orchid and had let it wither. And it makes these things more interesting." "It makes them disgusting. I should be afraid of some of the malaria clinging to them. And just think, there had been a dead body laying across that ugly thing. I never thought of that before. There, I declare I cannot eat another mouthful of dinner. I will take them off the table if you like, and put them in the window seat. I can see them just as well there." The next few days he was indeed singularly busy in his steamy little hothouse, fussing about with charcoal, lumps of teak, moss, and all the other mysteries of the orchid cultivator. He considered he was having a wonderfully eventful time. In the evening he would talk about these new orchids to his friends, and over again he reverted to his expectation of something strange. Several of the vandas in the dendrobium died under his care, but presently the strange orchid began to show signs of life. He was delighted, and took his housekeeper right away from jam making to see it at once, directly he made the discovery. "That is a bud," he said, "and presently there will be lots of leaves there, and those little things coming out here are aerial rootlets." "They look to me like little white fingers pointing out at the brown," said his housekeeper. "I don't like them." "Why not?" "I don't know. They look like fingers trying to get at you. I can't help my likes and dislikes. I don't know for certain, but I don't think there are any orchids I know that have aerial rootlets quite like that. It may be my fancy, of course. You see, they are a little flattened at the ends." "I don't like 'em," said his housekeeper, suddenly shivering and turning away. I know it's very silly of me, and I'm very sorry, particularly as you like the thing so much, but I can't help thinking of that corpse. But it may not be this particular plant. That was merely a guess of mine." His housekeeper shrugged her shoulders. "Anyhow, I don't like it," she said. Wedderburn felt a little hurt at her dislike to the plant, but that did not prevent his talking to her about orchids generally, and this orchid in particular, whenever he felt inclined. "There are some queer things about orchids," he said one day. "Such possibilities of surprise. You know, Darwin studied their fertilization and showed that the whole structure of an ordinary orchid flower was contrived in order that moths might carry the pollen from plant to plant. Well, it seems that there are lots of orchids known, the flower of which cannot possibly be used for fertilization in that way. There are no insects known that can possibly fertilize them, and some of them have never been found with seed. But how do they form new plants? By runners and tubers and that kind of outgrowth. That is easily explained. The puzzle is, what are the flowers for? Very likely," he added, "my orchid may be something extraordinary in that way. If so, I shall study it. I have often thought of making researches as Darwin did, but hitherto I have not found the time, or something else has happened to prevent it. The leaves are beginning to unfold now. I do wish you would come and see them." But she said that the orchid house was so hot it gave her the headache. She had seen the plant once again, and the aerial rootlets, which were now, some of them, more than a foot long, had unfortunately reminded her of tentacles reaching out after something, and they got into her dreams, growing after her with incredible rapidity, so that she had settled to her entire satisfaction that she would not see that plant again, and Wedderburn had to admire its leaves alone. They were of the ordinary broad form, and a deep, glossy green, with splashes and dots of deep red toward the base. He knew of no other leaves quite like them. The plant was placed on a low branch near the thermometer, and close by was a simple arrangement by which a tap dripped on the hot water pipes and kept the air steamy. And he spent his afternoons now with some regularity meditating on the approaching flowering of this strange plant. And at last, the great thing happened. Directly after entering the little glass house, he knew that the spike had burst out, although his great Paleonophis hid the corner where his new darling stood. There was a new odor in the air, a rich, intensely sweet scent that overpowered every other in that crowded, steaming little greenhouse. When he noticed this, he hurried down to the strange orchid, and behold, the trailing green spikes bore now 3 great splashes of blossom, from which this overpowering sweetness proceeded. He stopped before them in an ecstasy of admiration. The flowers were white, with streaks of golden orange upon the petals. The heavy labellum was coiled into an intricate projection, and a wonderful bluish purple mingled there with the gold. He could see at once that the genus was altogether a new one, and the insufferable scent. How hot the place was! The blossoms swam before his eyes. He would see if the temperature was right. He made a step toward the thermometer. Suddenly, everything appeared unsteady. The bricks on the floor were dancing up and down. Then the white blossoms, the green behind them, the whole greenhouse seemed to sweep sideways, and then in a curve upward. At 4:30, his cousin made the tea, according to their invariable custom. But Wedderburn did not come in for his tea. He is worshipping that horrid orchid, she told herself, and waited 10 minutes. His watch must have stopped. I will go and call him. She went straight to the hothouse, and, opening the door, called his name. There was no reply. She noticed that the air was very close and loaded with an intense perfume. Then she saw something lying on the bricks between the hot water pipes. For a minute, perhaps, she stood motionless. He was lying, face upward, at the foot of the strange orchid. The tentacle-like aerial rootlets no longer swayed freely in the air, but were crowded together, a tangle of gray ropes, and stretched tight with their ends closely applied to his chin and neck and hands. She did not understand. Then she saw from under one of the exultant tentacles upon his cheek there trickled a little thread of blood. With an inarticulate cry, she ran toward him and tried to pull him away from the leech-like suckers. She snapped 2 of these tentacles, and their sap dripped red. Then the overpowering scent of the blossom began to make her head reel. How they clung to him! She tore at the tough ropes, and he and the white inflorescence swam about her. She felt she was fainting, knew she must not. She left him and hastily opened the nearest door, and, after she had panted for a moment in the fresh air, she had a brilliant inspiration. She caught up a flower pot and smashed it in the windows at the end of the greenhouse. Then she re-entered. She tugged now with renewed strength at Wedderburn's motionless body and brought the strange orchid crashing to the floor. It still clung with the grimmest tenacity to its victim. In a frenzy, she lugged it and him into the open air. Then she thought of tearing through the sucker rootlets one by one, and in another minute she had released him and was dragging him away from the horror. He was white and bleeding from a dozen circular patches. The odd job man was coming up the garden, amazed at the smashing of glass, and saw her emerge, hauling the inanimate body with red-stained hands. For a moment, he thought impossible things. "Bring some water," she cried, and her voice dispelled his fancies. With unnatural alacrity, he returned with the water. He found her weeping with excitement, and with Wedderburn's head upon her knee, wiping the blood from his face. "What's the matter?" said Wedderburn, opening his eyes feebly and closing them again at once. "Go and tell Annie to come out here to me, and then go for Dr. Haddon at once," she said to the odd job man so soon as he brought the water, and added, seeing he hesitated, "I will tell you all about it when you come back." Presently, Wedderburn opened his eyes again, and seeing that he was troubled by the puzzle of his position, she explained to him, "You fainted in the hothouse." "And the orchid?" "I will see to that," she said. Wedderburn had lost a good deal of blood, but beyond that he had suffered no very great injury. They gave him brandy mixed with some pink extract of meat, and carried him upstairs to bed. His housekeeper told her incredible story in fragments to Dr. Haddon. "Come to the orchid house and see," she said. The cold outer air was blowing in through the open door, and the sickly perfume was almost dispelled. Most of the torn aerial rootlets lay already withered amidst a number of dark stains upon the bricks. The stem of the inflorescence was broken by the fall of the plant, and the flowers were growing limp and brown at the edges of the petals. The doctor stooped toward it, and saw that one of the aerial rootlets still stirred feebly and hesitated. The next morning, the strange orchid still lay there, black now and putrescent. The door banged intermittently in the morning breeze, and all the array of Wedderburn's orchids was shriveled and prostrate. But Wedderburn himself was bright and garrulous upstairs in the glory of his strange adventure.